name is Julia Blake. I have a master's in historic building preservation from University of York in England. I've been a Somerville resident for about a year and a half, so the Historic Society asked me to go ahead and give this talk on how to research your historic home. When deciding that you would like to find out some more info on your historic home, we find that it's best to work from your known information to the unknown. Don't start with vague, relative, like hand-me-down stories. If you want to start with something that is concrete that we already know. So every home has a history. It's just a matter of figuring out exactly how to get started on figuring that out. I usually feel like the easiest is figuring out the deed, which we'll discuss a little bit more later on. But if you already know either who you bought your home from, or if not that, who you're renting from, but anyway, we can always look online and see kind of a brief history of the ownership of your home in Somerville here. You can also talk to your neighbors. You can get a little bit more information about that if they've been there for a long time. Some people might have family photos. If they are long-term Somerville residents, some people just might have good stories about what's been going on in the neighborhood over the decades. The more information that you have, though, the easier that this search is going to be. Also will help you lead you to where you need to go to find out more information. So if you say already know the history of the neighborhood, maybe you can look at historic archives for newspapers and just kind of look and see what might pop up for your neighborhood and stuff like that. We often find that using primary sources as much as possible, though, really helps to get as much good information about your home as possible. So again, like I was saying, if you take your family, your great aunt's story about your house, her memory might have been a little lapse sometimes. So it's good to have these concrete things like these archives, maps, photos, stuff like that we'll talk about throughout this talk, to kind of bolster those fun family stories or neighborhood chat. So how do you decide that you have a home that's worth researching? It could be like a nice 90s bungalow, but there's not going to be as much fun stuff to look at as if you've got a really fun historic home. So the National Park Service actually has a really great website on preservation, how to do research, and then also what to do with that information once you have it. So this is just going through one of their guides. It's architectural character, identifying the visual aspects of historic buildings as an aid to preserving their character. This is just pulled straight from that. So their basic tenets were, it's good to identify the overall visual aspect first. Take a look at the wider frame of your home or even your neighborhood. So we know that in Somerville we have historic areas. So you might be in a historic neighborhood already. That gives us a clue that your home might be from a certain time frame, might have the same types of architectural details as others around it. That kind of also helps us figure out what time frame we need to go back to do as much research as possible. However, you can just look at your house, the shape of it, openings and entryways, the roof, like this really great mansard roof here with these dormer windows, porches and balconies with great trim, stuff like that. You can really kind of see, like, this is definitely a great example of a historic home. And then also the next step is this visual aspect at a closer range. They kind of say like at arm's length, really. So kind of get up close and personal with the outside of your house. Look at the materials that have been used. Is it wood? Is it stone? Is it brick? These things can definitely be more modern uses, but also they're all very, very key to certain time periods, especially here in Massachusetts. There's a lot more wood in historic homes than what we use these days. Certain brick looks different throughout different decades, so that's really important to kind of look at how does this brick look compared to a brand new building. You can also look at the craftsmanship. Obviously, we're going to have some really great details with kind of these more 1800s kind of houses than other areas, something from the 1920s is not going to look the same. So that kind of gives us a time frame, like I said earlier, about how far back we can look at the history of our home. And lastly, interior finishings. I think that a lot of Somerville homes have amazing interiors. So you look at the materials like the wood, plaster, if there's cast iron, there's great tile, stuff like that. You can definitely kind of get a clue of what time period your home is from. Also features such as fireplaces, balustrades, arched openings, certain light fixtures sometimes have been preserved over the years, which is great. They've not been torn down in the 70s. Cornices are also great, any sort of great crown molding, stuff like that. Also, if you have exposed beams or bricks or stone in your home, these can all be really great clues of the history of your house. So let's get into how to research now. The resources that we have are plentiful. We can start with public records on a grander scale. Everybody, like I was talking about before, can look up the deed of your house. This is true for every state in the country. Mass land records is really easy to access, and you would just go, you can see kind of in the top left, there's search criteria, and you can just change that to, I think it's a property description or something like that. And that will take you to your street number and street name. You can just put that in, and that will tell you exactly like who either owned your home, well, who owns your home currently, and then who owned it before then. The problem with this is that the digitized records only go to 1974 though. So that's something that we definitely, if you want to go further back than that, you are going to have to go to the physical archives. Wills and probates, so basically a probate record is created for the public supervision of an individual's property after their death. But a will can also tell you if someone passed on a property at the time of their death to a relative or other. So the deeds, again, can be at masslandrecords.com. A lot of historic wills and probate records are at mass.gov. And then next we've got building permits. So every building that is getting altered does need a permit, especially historic ones. So unfortunately, these I don't think are online as far as I can find. So you do have to go in person to find records of those. But that's really great if you know, I've got this house from the 1920s, but there's definitely an extension in the 80s, and you can kind of look that up at least. So that's definitely something really interesting that you can find as well. So these are just the locations of those physical archives for what I was just talking about. So both the Registry of the Probate and the deeds for the Southern District of Middlesex County are in East Cambridge at 28 Cambridge Street. That's it right there. And then if you want the building permits for Somerville, you do have to go to the Department of Public Works on Freeney Road. So let's talk about the resources here at the library. That's why we're all here. So we've got the local history room at the library. We've got the city directory, and reports and archives are all there. Through the library, you can also access a lot of really great databases. So there's answerhistory.com, historic newspapers, there's a lot of really great archives for those, which I do believe you have to look at in person. But then you can also look at Heritage Quest. Those, Ancestry.com and Heritage Quest, I feel like Kevin's going to talk about a lot more, so I'm going to hold off on my side of that. But maps and census information, they're all really fantastic ways to kind of look at the history of how your home may have evolved, as well as, you know, where it is in Somerville. City directory and reports, you can probably find a little bit more on ownerships of homes as well. And then the only thing I do want to mention that is if you're going to the local history room, that all the Somerville materials have a call number starting with S, which makes sense for Somerville. And again, the newspaper archives are on microfilm. So why those are really great is, like I was talking about before, is you might have historic pictures of your street. You might have, you know, there might have been an East Somerville festival at some point. You can go and have a look at historic pictures of that kind of stuff. Again, I think Kevin's probably going to talk a lot about how this all relates to looking up your family history as well. So I'll hold off on more of that. Another really awesome thing that we have access to is the Somerville.gov TV YouTube page. So there's all of these walking tours have been recorded in the time before COVID. But there's a really great one here by Ed Gordon about his favorite historic homes of Somerville. There's also just really great walking tours about different historic areas of the city. So I definitely would recommend, because you might just see, your house on there. So I'll play a little bit of a clip and you can kind of get an understanding of Ed getting excited about this.
I'm talking about the 10 most fascinating historic properties, at least fascinating to me, in Somerville. And we're going to be starting with 215 Washington Street in Union Square. William P. Walker. And so Walker went about this enlargement, and this has all been confirmed by consultants from Historic New England who went over and met with the owner and looked at the upper floor and a half and confirmed that this is a very early building up top. The extensive two-story L in the back dates to the mid-19th century. And this stands next to a gas station and a parking lot. On the other side is a new condo. And so, on the surface, it looks like a mid-19th century Italianate house, complete with a front porch with the chamfered posts and the bay windows, the octagonal bays that have brackets and cornices.
You can kind of get the idea. But he really, gets into it with all these houses that he talks about. And so that might be like a really great resource, not just for your own home, but if it's in your neighborhood, that might be able to give you an idea of exactly the kind of time frame that your house might have be built in if it was, a very similar architectural style. Okay, so what items are we hoping to find when we are looking at these archives? I'm going to start with maps because I think that they're the most useful tool in finding kind of when your house was built. And then also, if there's been extensions, you will be able to see that kind of stuff on these maps. So you can see these are both larger atlas maps of Somerville. On the left, we have the Bromley Atlas from 1895. And on the right, we've got the Hopkins Atlas from 1884. On the Somerville Library website, there's a whole bunch of other maps that you can definitely find that date widely. There's also the John G. Hales map that also has Charlestown from 1830, which is before Somerville went ahead and became its own city. You can look at, if you got the handout, researching the history of your house and your family, there's definitely a list of all of the different maps that are good to look up. But I do recommend kind of doing this online because these atlases, in person, it might be hard to see the tiny little streets, but online you can zoom in very, very minutely. So that's been super helpful. I was able to find my street, Willow Ave, on several maps, but you can't really see it on here. But if you zoom in online, it's so much easier. There's also online, they'll break it down into wards and then even further down from that into sections of wards. So if you're in the 4th ward, you might be able to find a specific map that has just that part of Somerville or even further breakdown of neighborhoods as well. So I definitely would recommend kind of playing around with that first, especially with these kind of mid-1800s, with so many houses in Somerville being built around, then you can kind of see, it might not have existed on this Hopkins map, but then, it was built a few years later and it is on the Bromley Atlas. So that's a really fun thing to kind of see. And if you can find maps from later on, you might see, there's the extension that somebody built. And stuff like that. So that kind of gives you an idea of when things happened. And then another great tool that we have access to is a whole bunch of photos. So these are from 3 different archives. On the left, we have the Dome MIT archives online. It is an unknown street in Somerville. It looks like a lot of streets in Somerville, but if you recognize it, please let me know if you know where that is. And then in the middle here, we've got one from the Digital Commonwealth. So that, again, is online, and that's on Dane Street. And then here we've got on the right, we've got Elm Street, and that's from the Somerville City Archives, which is on a Tumblr, and it is just all these photos, a lot of them from the 70s, and it's been really fascinating. I've got really sucked into those the last week. So that's been really great for just kind of scrolling down and seeing, if we can find anything that looks familiar. And that, I think, is still actually a pet store. So that kind of concludes my things I want to talk to you guys about, but I want to hear what your questions might be. What kind of things are you most interested in trying to find out about your home? What questions you might have about how to research stuff. So if you guys have questions for me, I'm happy to take them. Yes?
This doesn't have anything to do with my home, but I noticed on your handout it includes a book, Sears Modern Homes.
Oh, yes,
Are there any Sears homes in Somerville?
In Somerville, I'm not sure of. I know my parents used to live in one in upstate New York, though. And they had the original blueprints and everything, which were still on blue paper back then. So yeah, I'm not sure if there's any in Somerville, but that would be really interesting to find out. I'm sure that's something that we could definitely investigate. Yeah.
Where can you find the original floor plan for a home?
Oh, that is a very great question. That might be a little bit trickier to find, especially because a lot of times that wasn't kind of continued on. If a family member just decided this wasn't important to them, they might not be able to, locate that now. It might be something that is potentially in city reports. I would say even maybe if you go to one of the archives at over in Cambridge, they might have something as well. I'm not sure that a lot of things would have been kept, though. The reason my parents had the original blueprint for their Sears home that I was just talking about is because that home had been in the same family until my parents bought it. So luckily, the previous owner had kept on a hold of everything from when her father had the house built back in the 1920s. So it's always a little bit harder to find original blueprints and floor plans and stuff like that, just because not everyone in history has found it as interesting and rewarding as we do here in this room. Yes?
I've noticed that in some neighborhoods, a lot of houses seem to have been designed to the same plan, but then they've been modified individually.
Yep.
Was that the work of the original architect, or did people actually modify these houses as they went along?
As far as I'm aware, I think that a lot of times people, it's the same how they do nowadays in these kind of like cookie cutter, suburbs and stuff like that, where you're just having this complex, and it's kind of the same sort of thing where you just say, well, I would like this basic outline, but I want this slightly changed. I want the kitchen on this side rather than that side. I want, a powder room downstairs, or someone else does it. But for the most part, especially certain times of the centuries are going to have very similar floor plans. So you're going to find in the 1800s and early 1900s, there's going to be, everything is going to have its own little room. There might be a sitting room and a living room, but it's definitely going to be kind of all in a certain line. And a lot of alterations that happen are from people later on. So, yes. No, you're fine.
I've noticed that sometimes you go to a cheap house and everything looks like it's coming from Home Depot.
Yes.
But my house is like 110 years old. Mm-hmm. Was there manufacturers that manufactured these nice interior details that you would just go buy, or were they made for each house?
They would have been made for each house. Or like the most that you might find is, so they've got all the bricks from one brick maker, and all the wood comes from one place, and there might be one woodworker who does everything. And so it might be in bulk that all of these, balustrades are made, but for the most part, it's all going to be, smaller scale than what we have these days. That really didn't start until like probably the 50s.
Honestly, because the doors are very, very fancy.
Oh, yes.
The houses are. Were they made individually, the doors?
Yes, that would have been definitely.
Wow.
How do you research brick styles?
Ooh, I love bricks, so thank you for asking. So there's definitely just history on there's a lot of history on brick out there. I did my master's in England, where brick is a very big building material. So I'm not sure exactly on the history of brick as much here, but there is, I think, still material you can find, even if you just Google it. I'm sure you can find the history of brick in the US, but the smaller bricks are usually from the 1800s because they were kind of mass made by like just people. And nowadays they can be a little bit bigger because they're more machine made. They're also going to be more uniform now than they were back then, because making it by hand, I've done it myself, it's not easy, and it's definitely a little bit more room for human error. But I think that's the beauty of it as well. And before the Industrial Revolution, things were even a little bit more sloppy. So that's when brick really took off, because they could have a little bit more cookie cutter style with making bricks, and they came up with like bigger technology, I guess, to make uniform bricks. Whereas in the 1700s, it was all really, really by hand. So I could go all day about brick. And then also, I mean, looking at different types of stone were used in different time periods as well. Slate is really interesting because that kind of goes all along the Appalachians. So, Appalachians. From Pittsburgh, they would be mad if I pronounced it wrong. But there's a lot of great slate in like New Hampshire and Vermont. So some of it's from there, but a lot of American slate comes from North Carolina, actually. So that's always an interesting thing too. If you know you have a slate roof, if you can find any information on that, that's pretty cool. Then I'm going to hand it over to Kevin for his presentation.
So this is a pretty quick and basic introduction to getting started researching your family tree. And some of you may find this to be a lot of information. I want everybody to feel free to stop me with questions, or just ask me to expand on a topic, or clear up something that might be confusing. As with researching your house, you need to work from the known to the unknown. So if they're still around, a good way to start on a family tree is to talk to the older members of your family. So like if your parents are still alive, they probably remember not only their grandparents, but their great-grandparents, and that can easily take you back for more than a century in your family history. Also ask older family members just like what they might have in their attic. Letters, diaries, photos, legal documents, financial documents. You never know what you can turn up. One thing you need to be aware of when you're doing genealogical research is that eventually you're going to hit a lot of unknowns and be at a point at which it's just best not to make assumptions. And you're going to be working with two kinds of sources, primary sources and secondary sources. So primary sources are documents that are really close in time to the place or events that they record. So for example, a will, a death certificate, a birth certificate, letters individuals wrote to each other, newspaper articles reporting recent events. They're really like the gold standard of historical evidence, both just for history in general, as well as for your family history. Other kind of sources you'd be working with are secondary, which are records removed in time or distance or both from the original events or facts. They may be something as simple as handwritten copies of documents, or published family histories, say, self-published by somebody's grandfather or something, town histories, compilations of vital records. Never rely on secondary sources if you can help it. Always use secondary sources to lead you to primary sources. And one of the things that you also run into when you do genealogical research is you will just find out how different the world of our ancestors was in so many ways. And one of the first primary sources I'm going to talk about for genealogy is the US Census. It's held every 10 years, and theoretically it counts everyone in the US. You can find census records on both Heritage Quest and Ancestry.com. Heritage Quest you can definitely access from home with a Somerville Public Library card. Ancestry.com, the company we lease it from, ProQuest, said they would stop providing home access at the end of December of last year, but the last time I tried it from home, I could still access it. I believe that was a few weeks ago. But if you can't access it from home, you'll have to come into one of the Somerville Public Libraries to use it. And Ancestry is really great because a lot of the records I'm going to talk about, anything from city directory, census, draft registrations, town histories, a lot of those you can find on Ancestry.com, and they're adding more and more information to it constantly. Here's the granddaddy of them all, the 1790 census, the first US census. I don't know how well you can read this, but it illustrates what sort of place this country was at the beginning. The only people named in it are heads of households, and everyone else is a number. So this first column reads, free white males of 16 years of age residing with these families. Basically, this is the census of a country that had just finished a war and was considering the possibility that there might be another war with Britain very soon. And one of the primary reasons for this census was to determine how many men of military age were residing within our borders. And as the nation changed, and as government expanded its role, information in the census changed. So for example, by the time we reached the 1850 census, we had several administrations of the Whig Party. And the Whigs took a much more interventionist view of government in economic development. So there was a concern with what occupations were being practiced in this country, what professions, levels of education. And this was only 2 or 3 decades after McLean Asylum was founded. So there was also like a sort of primitive concern with mental health as they understood it at the time. This last category, whether deaf and dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or convict, the census takers were instructed to determine this information by asking the neighbors.
Not the husband or wife.
Here's just like a little interesting tidbit you can find. I think that one's name is Alice Franklin, under profession or trade. She's described as a domestic, and she was born in England. And can anyone make out the name encircled in red?
Douglas.
Yep. This is census information from Rochester, New York. His place of birth, Maryland, is listed, where he was born a slave. And under occupation it says editor Frederick Douglass's paper. He was a newspaper editor. And throughout the 1880s and 1930s, they were collecting more and more information, especially demographic information, for example, noting the birthplaces of any foreign-born U.S. residents were being recorded. And also here's a close-up of handwritten records of people's occupations. And this is a little interesting tidbit, radio set, determining how many households had a radio. And that was inserted into the census as a question after extensive lobbying by the advertising industry, who wanted to know whether they should continue focusing their energies on advertising in print media or whether they should devote more time to sound advertisements. Another source, interesting source of information that falls into the primary source category is military service records. A lot of these prior to the 1970s you can find on Ancestry.com. If you had a relative who served in the military, you can request their service jacket from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis. But the records are incomplete because there was large fire there in the early 70s. 1912 and earlier, most of the records are at the National Archives. And this next slide just gives another indication of what I find interesting about records like this. Again, the different mindset of the world people live in. This is a draft registration card for someone whose name you might recognize. And nowadays, for any kind of record recording the physical characteristics of a person, it's very precise. They're going to list the weight, the height, all kinds of very specific information. But for a draft card, back in 1914, 1915, they were just checking a bunch of boxes, like under height, they just checked tall. Build, medium. Color of hair, gray. If you go forward 20 years or so to draft cards for the Second World War, you can see that things got a bit more precise. They're actually listing J.D. Salinger's exact height, as well as his weight, and also I'm not sure why they needed to include the information that his complexion was sallow, but there you are. Now, where Somerville is really going to be helpful to people is who are researching local genealogy, is local records primary sources. So you're going to find deeds to homes at the Middlesex Registry of Deeds, marriage records, marriage, birth, and death records. You can find on both Ancestry.com and on microfilm for a set number of years. I think it's something like 1880 to 1940, on microfilm in both City Hall and at the library. City directories from the early 20th century are a great source for genealogists, partly because, unlike contemporary city directories, which are indexed by ward and precinct, city directories from, say, around 1900 are indexed by last name of person. And this is just like such a wonderful little snapshot of life in Somerville at the time. So you can see people's names, their occupations. So for example, there's a woman here just listed as widow of Thomas, which is kind of a sad but accurate statement of how peripherally society viewed women at the time. And like, for example, if you try to research something like naturalization records, up before maybe 1914, 1919 or so, you won't be able to find naturalization records for any female immigrant ancestors, because a woman automatically had the citizenship status of her husband. So if her husband was an immigrant and never became a naturalized citizen, even if she was born here, she wasn't considered a citizen. On the other hand, if her husband got naturalized and she was from out of the country, she was automatically naturalized as well. But like, for example, you get a lot of information about people such as John Mallet Carpenter, boards BDS period at J.H. Burke's on Vinyl Avenue. And you can see that, Linwood Avenue appeared to be, was probably a not very expensive street since 2 laborers lived on it. And, if you're descended from, say, someone named Evan C. Mann Jr., you can learn that he was a coffee and spice manufacturer. When you're trying to identify an ancestor, try to get as many records as you can. Because, for example, names can be notoriously unreliable. For example, I got an email once from a woman asking me to look up a marriage record for an ancestor named Helen J. Hilt. And I couldn't find it. And I said, tell me about her relatives. And so she told me a little bit about some family members she knew existed. And I went to look for her husband's name. And then I found the marriage record for a Lizzie Helen Holt. And then I started researching Lizzie Helen Holt. And then I found that she had all the same relatives and lived at the same address as the Helen J. Hilt that a patron originally wrote to me about. And also, the farther back in time you go, people were sloppy about names. For example, a woman baptized Martha might be known in the family as Patsy. That was a common nickname for Martha. How they got it, I have no idea. And a family member might tell a census taker, oh, that's my sister Patsy. And Elizabeth could be a Bess, an Agnes, a Nancy, depending on which sources you're looking at. And I just want to close with some things that are available at the Somerville Public Library, that almost all of which you can find on Ancestry.com. Census records for Middlesex County, Somerville city directories, Somerville poll tax listings, some immigration records, not a lot. Because before 1918 or 1919, a lot of immigration records were kept at the local level, especially naturalization records. And nobody, for example, nobody knows where Somerville's naturalization records are. They just have no idea. Veteran censuses, these were very important in the 19th century for determining who was eligible for pensions. Copies of town records, and again, databases, Heritage Quest and Ancestry.com. I know I mentioned them a lot, but they are invaluable. Here's some free online genealogical resources. FamilySearch.org. I recommend just making that your first stop, because your family tree could very well have already been researched. Family Search is a nonprofit operation of the Mormons, the LDS Church, and they believe in baptism by proxy. And so they are literally researching family trees of millions of people so that their names can be known for the baptism records of the LDS Church. A friend of mine who was raised LDS explained to me how baptism by proxy works. He said one day when he was 12, he and all his little friends were marched over to the local Mormon temple, and they were just all dunked in the water repeatedly while names of dozens of strangers were read out loud over their heads. Roots Web and WikiTree, they're both wikis. You know, people go online and they share information that they have. And then, got a lot of good resources, free resources, the National Genealogical Society, and also, of course, the U.S. Archives. And then accessgenealogy.com is a somewhat more informal operation, kind of akin to Roots Web and WikiTree. Does anyone have any questions? I know it went over a lot pretty fast.
Did you say that immigration records are available, but naturalization records are
Yeah, okay, on Ancestry.com.
Can you repeat the question, please?
He wanted to know if I said that immigration records were available, but naturalization were not. Yes, you're going to have a much better chance of finding immigration records than naturalization records, because immigration records would have, most people who immigrated to the Somerville area would have come through the Port of Boston. So there would have been records of all entrants to the country via the Port of Boston. Mm-hmm.
What city employees? What if you have a relative who was a city employee? Could you find records about city employees?
If you could find city annual reports or budgets, might mention them. If you could get your hand on city payroll records, certainly. The farther back in time you go, the smaller the Somerville City annual reports get, so the information gets more precise. Like I think in some of the first 20, 30 years of Somerville annual reports, they mention almost everybody who was employed by the city. Now in the publicly available city budgets, they don't do that. For example, I think in the most recent city budget that I've seen, I'm just listed as Librarian 2. Yeah.
Orphanages. My grandmother went to an orphanage when she was very, very young. Are orphanages required to keep records like this? Or?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer. Do you know our website, somervillepubliclibrary.org?
I will check it out.
Write to there's an address called Ask a Librarian. And if you can't find the Ask a Librarian form on the website, just call the reference desk, 617-623-5000, extension 2955. Well, in the city directories, if it says H for house, they probably owned it. But then if it said BDS period, they probably boarded. I know that there were plenty of rental houses in Somerville back in the day, but I honestly don't know how exactly you'd find that out. It's an interesting question. Something, again, worth calling the reference desk or writing to Ask a Librarian for, 617-623-5000, extension 2955.
What is that? What is that?
The reference desk at the library on Highland Ave. And it could very well be me answering the phone. So.
In those records that you're talking about, the H refers to the house?
Yes.
What does N refer to?
near.
Near. Okay.
Addresses weren't always very precise either. So like, something like, the closest thing in some cases to an address that you would have in a city directory might be such and such person's name, house, Vinyl, near Summer. So it was near the intersection of Vinyl Avenue and Summer Street. Okay?
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.